our vision is that one day, every person will have an affordable home in a vibrant community filled with promise and opportunity for a good life. Here in the Denver market, and Carrie, you can go to the next slide.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Here in the Denver market, we know that where we live matters, and we work to make well-designed homes affordable and to create communities with connections to opportunity so that everyone can thrive. We deliver capital, we develop programs, and we advocate for policies needed to create and preserve well-designed homes so that people can live in inclusive and connected communities. Some of our priorities here in Denver are advancing racial equity and supporting vulnerable communities and residents, increasing the supply of affordable housing by investing in new housing stock and preserving what we already have. And in the current pandemic environment, we're prioritizing the health of the affordable housing ecosystem by advocating for and connecting partners with the resources needed to continue to meet the needs, the current needs and the growing needs of low-income families during the pandemic and long after. We really believe in the power of good design. That's why we're so fortunate to be able to partner with our national design team, as well as all of the smart panelists you're going to hear from in a couple of minutes. We know from experience that well-designed homes can be affordable, which is why I'm so glad to have all of you here, as well as our panelists, to talk about designing for healing, dignity, and joy. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I think on the next, oh, sorry, I wanted to direct you to a couple of resources on the Enterprise website. So sorry about that, Carrie. If you can follow these links to visit our design website with the Design Matters Toolkit. We have a lot of great resources, past webinars. That's where all of the materials from this webinar will also be posted. So I encourage you to check that out and learn a little bit more about Enterprise and our design work. And now I'm going to introduce our panelists. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer Wilson. Jennifer is from the Center of Housing and Homelessness Research at the University of Denver. She's a doctoral candidate at the Graduate School of Social Work there, and her research interests center around the role of social innovation and interdisciplinary collaboration in addressing poverty, with a focus on the issue of homelessness. Jennifer is also a Dutch Blitz and UNO champion, at least in her own household during COVID. Next, I'd like to introduce Rochelle Maker. She's from Group 14 Engineering. Rochelle is a senior sustainability consultant and has over 15 years of experience in the industry, bringing a multidisciplinary approach to the concept of sustainable development. With her background in anthropology and also behavioral economics, her focus is on the cross-section of humans, nature, and the built environment. She is also known to sit in cold water as part of her healing practice. Next up, we have Laura Rosbert. Laura is from Shopworks Architecture. She recently joined Shopworks after working in the nonprofit world, leading organizations to have a deep impact in communities. Most recently, she was the interim executive director at the Dolores Project, where she co-led efforts to build a new homeless shelter and 130 units of affordable housing, ensuring both the programs and design of the building were trauma-informed. She also recently traveled across the country with her family in an RV. And next up, we have Chad Holtzinger, also from Shopworks. Chad founded Shopworks in 2012. And the primary focus of the firm is an urban infill development with a particular interest in affordable housing. If you are from the Denver area, you certainly have seen their work. It's beautiful. His unique multidisciplinary approach to design results in innovative and high-performing enduring architecture throughout the state, including backyard tree houses that, with the addition of an extension cord, now double as a remote learning space for his daughter. So with that, I will turn it over to our panelists who are going to share some of their research and experience with you. Thank you all for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie and Carrie. It's so great to get to collaborate with you all on this. So thanks so much for that opportunity. I'm just gonna, hopefully this is gonna do its thing. Also, there's, anyway, many faces and names that we've met before. So hi to all those wonderful folks. And we really want this to be a collaborative opportunity for us. The heart of trauma-informed design is about kind of collaboration across disciplines and really taking time to learn from each other. So each project, each building can be better. So I'm really, really excited for kind of the final 30 minutes where we can really have a chance to hear from one another. And we'll be doing kind of questions throughout and then more at the end as well. So don't hesitate to throw a question in the chat, and excited for this. So as shared, this whole trauma-informed design, which we really believe is about designing for healing, dignity, and joy and resiliency, is really a collaboration from a variety of folks. And it was really birthed at Arroyo Village, as Katie mentioned. I was the Deputy Director and Interim Executive Director at the Dolores Project, which is a homeless shelter for women and transgender individuals, both men and women, in Denver, Colorado. And we partnered with Rocky Mountain Communities to build 130 units of housing and a homeless shelter from the ground up. And I was implementing, there's a lot of best practices in supportive housing and when you're working with folks experiencing homelessness that really talk a lot about trauma. You know, so trauma-informed care and housing first are really best practices that are being used kind of in our schools now and in jails and really across a lot of spectrums. And we brought Shopworks Architecture, our designer, into a trauma-informed care training with Raul Almazar from SAMHSA. And it really kind of blew the architects' minds because architects are designed, you know, taught to design around spaces and numbers and HVAC. And they walked away and were like, we need to be designing for mental health. And then we had a lot of conversations over what does that look like? And we did a lot of research and we could find information on schools and not even schools, on like therapy offices and medical buildings. But there wasn't a lot of research and information sharing over what that really meant in supportive housing or in a homeless shelter. And so when I left, once we opened this grand building, I headed over to Shopworks for us to do this research and really ask these questions of what does it mean to have a trauma-informed design building? And Jennifer in a bit is going to go into that research, but I want to start and make sure that we're all on the same page to make sure we know what we're talking about when we talk about trauma. So when we're talking about trauma, what we're diving deep into is this ACE score, Adverse Childhood Experiences. This is a score from 0 to 10. It was utilized by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC in 95 to 97 to do a huge study in a middle-class suburb of how these ACE scores impacted people's health outcomes. And so your ACE score is very simple. If you've never done your ACE score, I encourage you to do it. And this really looks at kind of abuse and neglect and household dysfunction. And just kind of for each of these experiences folks have had, you get a score for each of them. And what was found is that 64% of Americans have an ACE score of at least 1. 16% have an ACE score of 2, 12.5% have an ACE score of 4 or more. And so when we're talking about trauma, what we really want to underline is this is not about those people over there. This is about how trauma impacts how all of us interact with each other and with the built environment. And so, you know, we focused on supportive housing, but, you know, for us, trauma is about how cities should be designed, how schools, how grocery stores. This should be about how everything is designed for everybody's healing and resiliency. And what they found when you looked at these ACE scores and then compared it to health outcomes and behaviors is, for example, if you have an ACE score of 2 or more, you're 4 times more likely to label yourself as an alcoholic. You're 3 times more likely to have attempted suicide. If you have an ACE score of 4 or more, you're 5 times more likely to self-report an experience of depression, and you're 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide. People who have an ACE score of 6 or higher die 20 years earlier on average than those who have an ACE score of 0. So these things are deeply, deeply impacting us and our health outcomes. And a number of people have asked kind of why, what does this look like? And I'll share in the chat. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris has a 15-minute TED Talk that's incredible. And she really talks about these health outcomes are about the impact stress has on the body. And she gives this great example. She's like, when you're out in the woods and you see a bear, fight or flight comes into play. And this is what helps you survive because it has you hide or run. So hopefully you live. But she says, what happens when the bear comes home each and every night? Well, what it does is it shifts our brains and our entire body's stress response. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex that's required for impulse control and executive functioning. It shifts the pleasure and reward center of the brain, and it impacts the amygdala, the fear response center. And so this talks about why folks who have high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in these high-risk behaviors. And even if you don't do these high-risk behaviors, you're still more likely to break bones or get cancer or have lung disease, right? And so this stress response that's there to help people thrive, instead of being adaptive, it ends up damaging the body. And one of the studies that I think I always keep in mind when we're thinking about design and how does this translate is Dr. Panksepp did this research study, and he put tufts of cat hair in the cage of mice. And for me, it's the perfect example because that cat hair can't hurt the mice, right? It's not going to attack them. But because of their interaction with cat hair on living cats, they cower in the corner. And they actually never then return to the similar level of play. And so for me, this is the thing. These are triggers for people. So when we were designing our homeless shelter, it's asking those questions of what is scaring people, is creating people to go into this fight or flight, even though it's perfectly safe, but it has a connection to a trauma in their life. And so with all of these things, these are the questions that we have about kind of, all right, there's good research about how it impacts our bodies. There's good research and evidence-based practices over what this means for programs. So now how do we take it to the next step and really have that impact the design of buildings? And luckily in this research, there is tons that we can draw upon. Rochelle's expertise in biophilia was a huge way this project was informed. So she's going to share about some of those best practices and information. All right, and Rochelle, you should have control now.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use biophilia as a design element to get at some of this healing, to get at some of this restoration that we're looking for in trauma-informed design buildings, and talk about the research behind that. Trying to move forward. Okay. So biophilia directly translates to love of life, and it was first used by Eric Fromm, but it really became popular in the 70s with E.O. Wilson. He's a biologist that really talked about our innate connection and our innate need to be around living systems and living things. And biophilic design is really bringing all the health benefits of being in and around nature into our built environment. And this is really important because we spend over 93% of our day indoors now, and probably even more now with COVID. And we are completely disconnected from our evolutionary biological connection to the outdoors. You know, we evolved in the outdoors. This is where our sympathetic nervous system thrives. This is where our prefrontal cortex was designed to thrive. And we essentially cut ourselves off from this. So there's a lot of health benefits. There's a lot of negative health impacts that happen from this disconnect, but there's also a lot of health benefits that come from being in and around it, both in our built environment and in nature in general. And over the last few years, the last decade or so, there's been a number of biophilic design studies that have looked at all aspects of the benefits of being in and around nature. They're physical, they're physiological, they're psychological, emotional, they're social, from reduced stress to increasing our immune system to increasing our recovery times in hospitals, both mental and physical, to better mood, more sociable, even more creative, more collaborative, and so forth. So there's so much research behind this that we don't have time to get into it, but I'm happy to share any of that with people if they're interested. We also know that being in an urban setting does the exact opposite. We know that people's pulse rates are higher, their systolic blood pressure is higher, cortisol levels are higher, the immune system is down, we're more irritable and so forth. So all this is happening to all of us just by being in an urban setting. But then when we're working with low income residents, we're adding a whole layer of stress that they're experiencing in terms of, reliable transportation or financial security or safety in their homes or the well-being of their children. So we're adding a whole nother level of stress that's really taxing their amygdala, their prefrontal cortex, and so on. And then when we talk about people that have experienced trauma, our PSH residents, then we're adding a whole nother thick layer of stress and things that are affecting exactly what Laura talked about, immune functioning, physical and mental health. So we keep adding these layers of stress, and this is very taxing on all sorts of our brain functioning and our physical functioning. And really leads to a lot of mental fatigue. And mental fatigue is really one of the biggest battles experienced by so many of our residents and all of us actually. And the more we're mentally fatigued, the less we are able to make good life decisions. We're less able to cope with the conditions that happen around us. We're more irritable, we're more aggressive. And it's very difficult just to get through daily life experiences when we have all this toxic stress on our daily life from the past or from the present. And biophilia can start to get at this. And this is what one of the main theories that we use specifically around trauma is this attention restoration theory. And this was developed by Kaplan and Kaplan. And they really pointed to the fact that that nature, though when we're in and around it, it engages us and it takes some mental focus. Instead of depleting us and fatiguing us, it actually restores us. It actually brings it enhances our ability, our cognitive abilities. It works with our amygdala. It works with our flight and fight response and so forth. And we're seeing so many benefits around not only just being out in nature, but also bringing these elements into our buildings in terms of hospital recovery stays. People leave hospitals much quicker. They need less pain medication when they have views of nature, have plants in the space. We see better test scores in students in school. We see more collaboration, more creativity, more productivity in offices. And we're also seeing some benefits in terms of residents and specifically in public housing. And one of the first studies around this was done by Ming Kuo, and she was actually looking at crowding and the effects of crowding on Chicago public housing. But when she looked at the results of her data, something was really interesting in that the people who faced streetscapes and parking lots had a very different experience than the residents that had an interior courtyard that they were facing. And there was nothing extravagant about the landscaping there as the picture looks. It's some grass and some trees. But there was immense difference in terms of their daily experience, and that residents with views of nature had less mental fatigue, reduction in domestic violence, better performance on attentional functioning, had lower drug and crime rates in these units, improved management of life issues, increased trust in neighbors and feeling of community, and we'll talk about the importance of community later on, and that children had better concentration and self-regulation, not only at home, but also in school. So immense amount of benefits just from having a little bit of access to nature. So you can imagine if we're much more conscious about how we're incorporating it into our built environment, this can be really effective. So, we're promoting just that our built environment matters, that it can heal us, that it can be a therapy beyond just the logic and speech centers, but that we have to incorporate all of these aspects in order to get at healing, to get at joy, and to create dignified spaces. So just briefly what this looks about, because we could actually point to the science behind all of this, what listening to running water does to our amygdala, what looking at fractals does to our prefrontal cortex. There's all this science behind how each of these affects our brain, but we don't really have time to get into that. But I want to talk about a little bit how different housing structures have incorporated this. So when we talk about biophilic design, it's generally categorized into 3 different categories. There's a nature in the space, natural analogs, and nature of the space. And the first one, nature in the space, is kind of just how it sounds, that we're bringing nature into the space, that we have plants, that we have daylight, natural ventilation, pets, sounds of water, and so forth. Especially if we can have indoor, outdoor spaces, again, bringing in natural ventilation and daylight as much as possible. Natural analogs is when we're mimicking different elements of nature, and then we're bringing them into the built environment. So a big part of this would be like fractals, where these repetitive shapes that we see in nature through branching, through tree leaves and things like this. And we're bringing that into the built environment through different biomorphic forms and patterns that have been shown to, increase creativity and also allow us to relax. We also look at this in terms of natural materials, bringing woods and stones, especially if they have an ecological attachment to place, and they can really have a grounding effect for people. So just a few examples of the natural analogs. And then the last one is nature of the space. And this is really how we're designing the layout of our spaces to mimic different experiences that we look for in nature and in our different environments. And the most important one here to really touch base on is prospect and refuge. And this is something we look for in every space that we go to. We want prospect and this is creating great viewpoints so that we know our opportunities, we know our challenges, we know what we want to go after and what we want to avoid. And this gives us a strong sense of security and confidence in our space so that we can relax and be present. Also, we look for refuge. This is like creating a space that has kind of our back shelter to our back. And this again allows us to feel safe and secure, to be more introspective, and allows us to go inward in a comfortable environment. So we really want to look at how we can create these different spaces for prospect and refuge. Also, hearth-like spaces are really important. These circular spaces, long used by Native Americans in terms of opening us up and allowing us to be more collaborative. A lot of research behind reducing hierarchies and how we are more open to other people when we're sitting in a circle, and how we're more willing to open up ourselves. And community is so important when we're dealing with trauma in order to help ourselves heal and be open to others, and also create a space where we can be present with others in the building. And incorporating some fire or water into those spaces can also be really beneficial. And also Chad will talk a bit more about mobility and wayfinding, but this is incredibly important in terms of knowing where you are in the building. So many of our permanent supportive housing residents, they have had so many transitions in their life. They moved in and out of so many spaces, and this is very jarring and causes a lot of stress in and of itself. So we really want our movement through the building to also kind of can also ease that comfort. And so we have a sense of where we are in the building, that these transitional spaces aren't jarring, that we have some sort of attachment to place, that they're well daylit, and they can also provoke some joy and awe and things like this. And then absolutely lastly, we want to create spaces for people to get outside. There's no amount of biophilic design that's going to negate our need to feel the sunlight on our face, to hear birds chirping, to dig our hands into the dirt, whatever it is. So finding places that people can get outside in a safe and secure way, making them diverse, making them have shade, and allowing people to access that. And that's it for me. And I'll pass it over to Jenny, and she'll talk a little bit about the research that we all worked on together.
Great, thank you so much, Rochelle. All right, so as Laura and Rochelle said, I'll talk a little bit about our initial round of exploration on this topic. There we go. In conducting this research, we knew we wanted to understand how trauma-informed design worked and its potential impacts on health and well-being. And we knew that we wanted to really anchor our understanding in the perspectives of those who were living in the building and had this lived experience of trauma. In this case, for this round of research, we really focused on those who had the experience of the trauma of homelessness, but we understand that there are certainly applications for trauma-informed design with lots of other groups. So we identified 3 supportive housing sites in Denver and Fort Collins, where a trauma-informed lens had really been integrated into the design. And we've since conducted lots of interviews and focus groups across the state at other housing sites. But for this round of data collection, we focused on these 3 sites. We did tours of the buildings, and then we also conducted a total of 11 focus groups, focusing on residents of the building, but also making sure to speak to staff at the different sites. And for this round, we also did surveys to make sure that everyone could participate in some form. The surveys were largely qualitative, the focus groups were largely, or quantitative, the focus groups were largely qualitative. And we used sort of this mixed methods approach to make sure that we really understood what we were hearing from folks. We were curious about specific aspects of the built environment that either attended to trauma by promoting safety, healing, dignity, or perhaps triggered a trauma response. So areas where folks felt unsafe, aspects that folks felt stifled dignity and empowerment. And we collected a lot of data, piles of data from our tours, our observational data of what we were seeing, things that we were hearing from people, sort of informally, but also during the focus groups and interviews. And we asked ourselves, how do we synthesize everything that we're hearing and seeing in the data on this topic? We knew right off the bat that it would not be a one-size-fits-all solution or a clear sort of checklist detailing how to ensure that a design is in fact trauma-informed for everyone. We knew that that wasn't possible because we were hearing over and over again, and we know personally, right, that everyone's traumas, triggers, needs, they're different. And sometimes they represent totally opposite ends of a spectrum. So one person in our focus groups would say that they crave solitude and they spend all their time in their apartment. And another person in that exact same group would say that they sought out constant human contact and support from other people for their trauma response. Some appreciated background noise and that comforted them. Some needed silence and stillness. And so rather than pinpoint these exact specifications of what trauma-informed design was or how to do it, we really focused on higher level constructs. And this is sort of the process of working through the data. Higher level constructs or unifying themes that spoke to broader aspects of the building experience, that aspects that either promoted or inhibited this sense of healing, feelings of being valued, of dignity. And we worked through lots of different visualizations, as you can see, ways for understanding how these ideas work together, for working through our learnings on the topic. And this is where we've landed right now. And there's an evolution and iterative nature to this process. So this is the preliminary framework for trauma-informed design that our team has landed on. At the center, we've got the, oh boy, we've just moved quickly through all the slides. Here we go. At the center, we've got the 3 C's of designing for health and healing. So these 3 C's are truly at the center of the trauma-informed design and decision-making process. This is where all of the data, all of the focus groups, everything that we heard from folks living in the buildings, these are the higher level constructs that they were speaking to. Around the 3 C's are the 6 core values, and these values really support and guide the decision-making process from beginning to end. And then around the entire framework are the 3 contextual factors that pervade the process. Context, obviously, is important to be considered in all decision-making and everything we do. Not only can the contextual factors not be ignored, but as Chad will talk about, in the very best circumstances, by understanding and celebrating context, you can actually elevate the design. So I'm going to be focusing on the 3 C's. And this slide is not terribly interesting, actually. So feel free to look out the window and be carried away on a cloud of 3 C's with me. So again, these are the unifying themes that we heard residents raising over and over again in our interviews and focus groups. Even as their personal preferences may have been different, we heard that comfort, community, and choice were the constructs that they all seem to be talking about. And again, it's not a checklist. Wouldn't it be easy if it was? But really we see the 3 C's as being more of a holistic mindset. This is a way of thinking about the work, a way of approaching the work. So I'm going to talk about the 3 sort of at length and offer some examples from our focus groups. So when we talk about comfort, we're talking about the quality of the building materials or the fixtures in a space. We're talking about attention to aesthetics in the large and small details. These are elements in the built environment that spark joy, that allow a person to be at ease, to let their guard down. These aesthetic elements are not only appealing to all the senses, but ultimately they communicate value. They infuse a sense of dignity in the space. They say to someone, you're worth all of this. And we heard that come up over and over again. So some examples, ways that this came up. Folks talked about something as simple as the wall colors, that they were done in calming and appealing hues. They allowed personalization and sort of identity development for the floors, like people saying, we're the purple floor, and there was some pride in that. And they also assist with wayfinding, as Rochelle mentioned. Folks talked about natural elements that bring the outdoors indoors. So a fish tank in the hallway of one building got a lot of mention as being a healing element or a favorite place. Solid wood furniture versus plastic, that really communicated value to folks. Wide ledges where people could put plants. One building was absolutely filled with plants, every single unit we saw, every space. Colorful pieces of artwork. A colorful piece of artwork next to the mailbox of one of the buildings was raised a lot. And folks talked about how this beautiful investment didn't just spark joy, but it made them feel really important that this investment was made for them and just purely for their pleasure. Folks talked about how nice the light fixtures were in one of the buildings. And it was a detail that I was surprised that people mentioned, but they talked about like the high quality of the light fixtures and how much they appreciated that. And then an example that I like to talk about in one of the buildings, in one group, folks unanimously raised the couch in their living room as one of their favorite places in the entire building. And this was an experience shared by so many people. And they were really enthusiastic about the couches. And they talked about how comfortable they were and how cozy they felt there. But with a trauma-informed lens and thinking about the experience of homelessness, this makes a lot of sense. The couch is not just, a simple piece of furniture, but it's situated in a place in the apartment that allows you to have a view of all of the entrances and exits. You see the door, you see all the windows, you see all the rooms. It's typically situated in a room with a television. The television is a source of light and noise if nighttime is unnerving and it's hard to sleep. So the couch begins to represent so much more than just one piece of furniture in the building. When we talked about community, most obviously we were thinking about how people coexist with one another, right? We know that human connection is associated with healing and with the experience of trauma, but as we started to comb through the data, we found that there was so much more nuance in how folks talked about community. And the way that we sort of organized what we had heard was to put community into sort of 2 buckets. Community inside the building and community outside of the building. And within the building, there was further nuance. There was community with the folks on your floor, right? These are the people who you can hear what they're saying, you can smell what they're cooking, you do laundry together, you throw away trash together. Then there were folks who you shared interests with. These were the people who gardened on the rooftop patio. These were the people you smoke with out in on the back lawn. Folks you play bingo with in the downstairs community room. And then finally, within the building, we heard a lot about resident staff interactions and how critical these interactions are and how space really shapes these interactions. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Then outside the building, again, there was nuance. There were interactions between residents and the folks who were visiting them, people who are coming to the building to see them, who are coming into the building and into their unit. There were interactions between the residents of the building and the immediate neighbors of the building. Oftentimes they share a view of each other out their windows. So the importance of recognizing that interaction. And then finally, the interactions of the residents with the rest of the city. bus routes and walking paths and proximity to important things. And so a few examples that came out of the data along the lines of community that were really interesting and very informative include how people interact with spaces like trash and laundry rooms. And this came up over and over again, how these spaces typically feel pretty unsafe and undignified, right? It's a huge metal door, it slams behind you. It's the only entry and exit oftentimes. So you can imagine if you've had the trauma of homelessness, where safety on the streets is always an issue, or perhaps domestic violence or intimate partner violence, how that would feel. Few, if any, windows, strong odors, and then usually they're tight spaces where there's a lot of human contact. If you're in a laundry room with another person, your bodies are rubbing up against each other as you're trying to slide past each other to get to the washing machine. So just thinking about those spaces. When it comes to staff interactions, a lot of residents talked about appreciating when staff spaces were near amenity spaces. We observed it, we heard it, that people wanted to meet and interact with other residents, but they wanted to do it in the presence of staff. And once I get to know you and trust you, then perhaps I invite you into my apartment. And we saw that often amenity spaces far from staff were empty. We heard people talk about the workout room and how bullying happened there and how they didn't feel safe there, for example. We also heard people say, sort of in the same breath, that it was important that there was some privacy that they could enjoy with staff in those amenity spaces. So if you did need to speak to staff about something, that you could approach their desk and you could talk to them without a cluster of chairs right next to you where other people were listening in on your conversation. So just really striking a balance between public and private interactions between staff and residents, and sort of access and separation. Another interesting story on the topic of community, and then I'll move on to choice. In terms of outside guests visiting the building, we heard from one woman who she would visit with her husband and she didn't want him in the building and she didn't want him in her apartment. So they would meet outside of the building, out front. And she just remarked on how there wasn't a place for them to sit. There was no bench or sort of side courtyard. And so they would sit on the curb next to the grate, the gutter. And that's where they would sort of work through their relationship and hash out the details of their lives together. And so, so that was very telling about her experience of trauma and how it related to her ability to interact with her husband in that space. Then finally, choice. These are the elements that allow people to engage with their space and with others at different levels. The ability to personalize your environment, your apartment, or to have choice in whatever maybe community environment you're in. Opportunities for choice through the built environment, they promote agency and ownership for residents. And we saw this as a recurring theme. When choice was offered, folks had a sense of control, and control leads to empowerment. And when there's a lack of choice, we heard over and over again that it brought about an experience of infantilization, so being treated like a child, feeling like a child, or reinstitutionalization, especially for those who had had the experience of being involved with the criminal justice system or incarceration. And so examples of how this came out in our data. Folks talked about a desire to have blackout shades, something as simple as that. The choice to have total darkness in their room when they slept. And if you think about the experience of homelessness and the fact that lots of folks who sleep in shelters or on the street, they don't get to sleep in total darkness. That's a privilege, actually. Oftentimes shelters are not totally dark so that staff can observe what's going on, so that people can make their way to the bathroom. And then for folks sleeping on the streets, a lot of folks sleep during the day so that they can watch their belongings and watch their back at night. And so just the opportunity to have blackout shades and the choice to have total darkness when you sleep. People also voiced a desire to control lighting and amenity spaces, something as simple as that, a dimmer switch, so that you could have a little bit of choice even in that public setting. One building allowed residents to select between 2 furniture colors to personalize their own apartment. We conducted groups in a building where they didn't have ovens. And this was a huge complaint for folks. I mean, if you think about agency and empowerment, being able to prepare your own meals, that's sort of the most basic form of control over one's own life. And it's not just being able to prepare food where, like if you're in shelters or on the street again, if you're going to food pantries or soup kitchens, your choice around food are really limited. But it's also the opportunity to give back, right? To share a meal with others, to prepare food for others, to celebrate your own tradition, cultural heritage, memories, family. And so kitchens, ovens, and this opportunity to prepare meals with a trauma-informed lens, it represents so much more. And finally, this was one of my most surprising findings of all of the research so far, which was that, you know, we were doing these tours, and they were always given by folks who lived in the building. And we found that in every building, everyone knew exactly how many windows they had in their apartment unit, and really how many windows everyone in the building had. And we heard about their layouts, the layouts of their apartment, and then the layouts of their neighbors or their friends. I have a larger living room, so-and-so has a larger bedroom. And I kept waiting for someone to say, it's not fair, and we should all have the same. And I would kind of probe to get at it. And over again, folks said, no, it makes sense. It's an opportunity for this personalization, right? I entertain a lot, so I have a bigger living room, and that works for me. So-and-so cooks a lot, so she has a larger kitchen. And just, it really seemed to speak to the adage, you know, variety is the spice of life. And people seem to really appreciate that. So again, areas where choice and personalization were celebrated and appreciated by residents. So I'm going to move on to the core values. These 6 core values, like I said, they permeate the work from beginning to end. Ideally, they help establish shared intentions across the project team, aligning priorities and providing an elevated set of goals for all decision making. But they really also speak to the envisioned outcomes of a trauma-informed environment. What can be achieved when trauma truly informs various aspects of the design. So they have a beginning, middle, and end utility. They wrap the project. So just to provide a tiny bit of background information about how we arrived at these 6, Jill Pable is at Florida State University in architecture and design, and she's done a lot of work in this area. And she developed a separate set of qualities. She called them the 6 human qualities that most people desire for physical and mental health in the places they inhabit. That's a mouthful. And so that was a useful set of qualities to think about. Chad Holtzinger, who's here and will speak from Shopworks Architecture, arrived at his own dozen qualities or values or key considerations for designing for people, designing for dignity and joy. And so we really synthesized both expert perspectives to arrive at what we felt was a more succinct set of core values. And this is sort of the basic presentation, but each one can be unwrapped and considered more deeply. I'll just go through them quickly. When we talk about hope, we're talking about hope, dignity, and self-esteem, connection and community, joy, beauty, and meaning, peace of mind, safety, security, and privacy. And when we talk about safety and security, we're talking about real and perceived, like Laura mentioned with the tuft of hair in the mouse cage. And then empowerment and personal control. And finally, I'm just going to end on the contextual considerations. We know that context pervades all aspects of our work. The environmental context is not only the explicit environment around us, the climate and the geography of a place, but it also speaks to the less explicit environmental forces. This is maybe a historical context, an economic context, a political context. These are the systems and institutions that are at work all around us. When we talk about cultural context, we're talking about memory, tradition, cultural identity of a place. Cultural forces, they're complex, right, and dynamic, and understanding them is really tied to listening, to building trust, to building relationship. And then finally, lived experience. When we're talking about lived experience, it's not only the lived experience of residents of the building, but and that is the priority really, to hear from folks who are going to live in the space, but just also want to raise the fact that the lived experience of the architects, the engineers, the developers, the funders, the neighbors, right? Everyone comes to the table with their own set of experiences, their own traumas, their own beliefs and assumptions, stereotypes and biases. And so really just having your eyes open to all of it. And we know that we can't disregard context for a project or for the people living in a building or in an area, but with a bit of effort and by really understanding and celebrating these various contextual factors, by harnessing context, we believe that you can in fact elevate the design. And so we've got Chad Holtzinger from Shopworks here, and he's going to talk about his experience and examples that give this framework real and applied meaning.
All right. Thanks, Jenny.
Hold on. I don't think... Oh, Jenny, I think you're doing it.
Oh, sorry.
Just stop touching your screen. Sorry, y'all.
We're really
sorry.
moving.
All right, Chad, you should have control now.
All right.
Step away.
I'm going to try and unwind some of this. This is like a sneak preview.
Don't look.
Cool. Well, now that we've gone through kind of the foundation and framework of the research, I get the privilege of just showing pictures and talking about how these things kind of apply into the built environment. And, some of this we've post-rationalized maybe, but some of it we've actually tried to really actively engage with the principles that Jenny and Rochelle and Laura have been talking about as a function of our research. And so how to connect people with their community is essentially the gist of it. Maslow's hierarchy, I think, is really interesting to me because architecture and the built environment developers are really pretty good at physiological needs and safety needs, kind of the basics of the human experience. But what this is all about is actually trying to connect higher level ideas into the experience of our environment. So love and belonging, what is a place that engenders that? Or what's a place that might actually estrange people? What is a place that can affect self-esteem or ultimately self-actualization? How can the built environment help folks kind of transcend their experience of day-to-day life? We really like the idea of memory of place and of iconography of place. And in the architecture that we're doing, a lot of times we try to collaborate with local artists who understand the cultural context and the meaning of place, and connect our buildings into a neighborhood in a meaningful contextual way. Also, we really love mixed use buildings because it creates round the clock energy in neighborhoods where housing has its vibe, the ground floor and mix of use has its, and there's places for overlaps and empathy from people who may not live together but are adjacent. And our autocentric culture really divorces us from the possibility of that. So to the extent that our neighborhoods are thinking those kinds of thoughts, it's really great. The interior architecture is really important as it relates to all of these concepts. The integration of art inside can be really important and powerful. Rochelle's ideas about natural materials and authentic materials, things that aren't really hard to understand, that just feel like they're part of the world from the outside coming in. There's also the ideas of transparency, and this is a resource center in Denver that we did, and the boardroom, the operator really felt strongly to have a transparency and kind of culturally relevant artwork and connection into the neighborhood. we've also spent a lot of time thinking about entryways and what it is to take the leap of faith to enter a building, especially for folks who've experienced trauma of varying sorts and have a relationship with the built environment that is not intuitive to folks who've been housed or who haven't suffered with, what am I looking for here? Kind of authoritarian type of relationships with the police or the school principal or parents or something like that. So how do you enter the building? What makes it welcoming? Is there seating? Is the lighting good? Is there a way out? Does it feel like it's defenseless? Is it around a corner or is it open? So connecting architecture into the streetscape, and then what happens inside, is it welcoming and friendly? Another thing that came out of the research, which was kind of like a duh and an aha moment simultaneously, is that folks experiencing homelessness have had a tenuous relationship with laundry. You know, leaving all of your possessions at a laundromat or at a cleaner's is really stressful. And so we came up with an idea with a client of ours around the idea of a laundry spa. So maybe it's the kind of place where there's a library and a fireplace and you could have a friendship or take your kids here to do homework. Or maybe it's a fitness idea. Entering into the building, I think, is always something that matters. The first impression projects a value to the way guests perceive a space. This is a adult programming space for a group in Denver called Laredin, who works with individuals with intellectual disabilities. And in their adult programming, the idea of connecting the spatial relationships for connection while using daylight, natural materials, and acoustic deadening materials actually was a big part of the idea, so that the experience of the built environment was calming, not aggravating. And the buildings that they came from were kind of shoehorned into old warehouses and kind of in the spirit of bootstrap nonprofit-y service providers. And moving into a place like this has really improved outcomes as well as staff retention and things like that. This is a fun little project we did for homeless youth. It's the renovation of a mansion, and we can't really take credit for much of anything here except not screwing up the building. But the idea is that connecting kids in a place with staff living in-house with a dignified setting, really giving the opportunity to connect with others in the home and build enduring relationships. This is kind of the boring part of my presentation. The McLeany curve is something that architects and real estate people think about. And you can kind of see curve number 3 is the normal design process. Curve number 4 is kind of what enterprise, I would say, are used for. And it helps to yield a better outcome. I think with trauma-informed design, what we're actually kind of thinking about is like how in the pre-design phase do you gather enough information to really understand the problem for which the real estate project is solving. This isn't always intuitive, and I will say that for the projects we're working on now, it's actually kind of hard to get the inertia and the energy started early enough that the nature of the research can inform the basics of a real estate project. And I saw in the chat, is there any funding for trauma-informed design, and if I had a recommendation for, you know, whatever that might become, the idea would be to find ways to find pre-development funding for research to scope the problem, because every single project we've looked at has a weird requirement that's not intuitive, and that really can make an impact in the ultimate form. This is a really great project we're working on in Fort Collins. It's a trauma-informed building that used to be a movie theater. And it does have windows. You can see them there by the entry. Uh-oh, our slides are all mixed up. Well, maybe we don't have the outside. This is the inside. After we actually add windows and skylights, there'll be an atrium in the middle. And so this project is just thinking indoor, outdoor thoughts, but it's also thinking indoor thoughts about the creation of that community that Jenny was talking about inside. So what is it to connect with the residents of the building and have visual safety? You know, the one really cool thing about an atrium is when you leave your apartment, you kind of have the prospect of the entire building, and you know who's kind of where, and if, you know, if Laura's over there, I'm kind of mad at her, and I might just kind of creep back into my unit for a minute while she passes through. Those things are important considerations as it relates to calming a building. Providence at the Heights. This is a project we did in Aurora, Colorado for the Second Chance Center, who's bringing formerly incarcerated individuals into connecting them with resources, jobs, and housing. Our idea here, our client's idea was, you know, we want a building, this is right by the West Tollgate Creek, which is a really beautiful Western riparian kind of landscape. It's got dogwoods, water, animals, and grasses like deep reds and blues and stuff like that. It's really amazing. And their idea was like, we want a building that really emerges from the landscape. We don't want something that was plopped down by you know, some real estate committee, but something that connects to the built environment. This was just a lucky picture that somebody took. But again, the idea of natural materials. There's also an idea about the layering of space so that folks can connect with one another where they're comfortable. That can be in intimate groups, 1 or 2. In this image, you know, 6 or 8 people might connect, and sometimes it's a bigger gathering. Memory. The Arroyo Village project, one of the Dolores Project traditions when a woman entered the shelter was that they'd be given a quilt that was handmade by an armada of volunteers. And, you know, when we were designing that project, we knew that gosh, these are all out of whack. These are really all out of whack. We knew that we didn't have a giant budget, but we did have a really stunning narrative about how to connect this tradition into an architectural expression. And so we took this idea of a quilt and made it into the architectural expression. Additionally, the idea of bringing nature in and connecting people to a dignified entrance. This image is the entrance to the homeless shelter. So it's the very first thing that somebody sees. 2 steps in from the door, a view out to a courtyard, a beautiful living area. There's ways out. It's not intimidating, and it's certainly not clinical. And creating the atmosphere where people can feel comfortable letting their guard down and establishing connections with others is what this is designed to do. Phyllis, one of our favorite, this was move-in day. Volunteers of America's idea of trauma-informed design is interesting, and Rochelle touched on it. It's the idea of permanence. We're not going to leave you. We're not going to move. We're not going to disappear. And so the architecture of VOA is usually really got a permanence to it, kind of a formality. On the interior, we're also thinking again about the layering of space, the use of materials to soften the experience, indoor-outdoor connections. In Colorado, we're really blessed with sunshine all the time. So blackout shades notwithstanding, you know, I do feel like having great visual access indoor and outdoor, and physical access indoor and outdoor, is always something we consider in the overlap of space. Last little project I'll share is a project that's opening next week in Grand Junction. This is a really sweet little development for homeless youth. And the executive director of the operator for this building really wanted something that encapsulated this idea of hope. What is it to take a youth who's experienced undoubtedly the most stressful thing of their life in the form of homelessness, and then reintegrate them with the idea of connection and hope and relationships that aren't intimidating or scary, but are affirming and create a reason to live. So both the front and the back are designed with different attributes of that. You know, a lot of space to get out and play. You know, you can see that big climbing rock that literally happened. You know, after a lot of controversy around insurance policies and stuff like that. But the idea of connecting kids with their bodies and adrenaline and affirmative relationships, gardening, nature. And then also to have a place inside that is really messing around with different scales of things and daylight, obviously, and cafe-like. A lot of Karis's outreach happens in cafes, and they really wanted to have a place where kids could lounge, sidle up, kind of skulk in the corner, but no matter what pattern they chose, that they could connect into a community in a really unique and engaging way. So anyway, I think that's kind of it for me.
Great. So I'm excited to get to our time of questions, but we do have a paper that Chad shared in the chat. Because it is important, we do provide kind of some questions and some more, you know, there's no checkbox for is the building trauma informed, but there are good questions that you can ask yourself and self-reflect to see. And so these are some of our recommendations of questions to ask yourself. And we also have kind of example questions to ask potential residents and things of that nature as well to kind of fill out all of those pieces. But I know we have some really great questions in the chat we want to get to, but you know, for us, you know, they're kind of good questions as we want to continue this work and what that looks like. You know, because as Chad noted, you know, when you need to be doing this is when a lot of affordable housing projects kind of have the least funding, which we are well aware of. So anyway, so we're excited to get to some questions and conversation and hear great ideas you all have.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely, it's a lot of questions, which is great. Sometimes they just kind of trickle in. So I'm going to start with some of the heavy hitters. So let's see here. I had promised Chris here that he would kick us off. So let me start with this one. Many state housing agencies have incredibly prescriptive design standards for affordable housing that may limit personalized design and therefore limit the opportunity to implement trauma-informed healing-centered design. Have you encountered those limitations, and if so, how have you worked around them? or moved the agency away from limiting design standards? Chad, I think this one's to you, but Laura, jump in there.
I can take a crack at it. I mean, I think in Colorado, our experience has been that there's not usually prescriptive standards. Most of the housing agencies and housing developers we work with are really thinking about working the problem from the inside out, and it's really great because this is a process of curiosity, and it's not a prescribed answer. And so finding those deep connecting threads is a really important part of the process, and having an open enough mind and a prescriptive less environment to work in really makes a big difference there. And so like the quilts with Arroyo Village, or that amazing artist Bimmer in the first couple of slides we illustrated, finding ways to really deeply connect into a neighborhood or into a community or into a operator that creates meaning around a narrative that people can enjoy. So I would say advice on that, if I were entering into an environment like that, I'd probably start really early in that programming phase and that initial outreach and research phase, asking some questions about what's the edges of the universe and how can we get there, and what creates meaning and value in this community.
Awesome. And yeah, Enterprise's new project priorities survey as part of the launch of the Green Communities is really pushing developers to do just that early, to get out and be talking to people. So just a public announcement about that. Another great question from Chris Belk in your neck of the woods, which I know is on everybody's minds. How do you prioritize these elements over others in a rising cost of construction market and limiting resources to build community development projects, trade-offs to larger family units, parking, green features, PV systems? How do you make it happen? These are beautiful projects, but you see a lot of dollar signs on the images. So how do you make the magic happen?
Well, the simple answer is that when we're going into a new project, that early phase is really about values alignment. And that means something different to everybody. And every project we've worked on, there's never two answers. It's some of the context in which we work. But if a great community connection space with an indoor-outdoor vibe to it is a priority, that may mean that the units get smaller, or that we don't do individual private balconies, for instance, or if we're thinking really aggressive environmental sustainability thoughts, that might mean that we trade it off on a parking ratio and go to fight with the city about cars. So there's no prescriptive answer. Getting back to just process, it's really about the McLeamy curve and getting ahead of the curve so that when these things come up, that we're prepared with how we would prioritize a decision-making process, because it is a guarantee and a fact that we're not going to get 100% of anything we want. It's really boiling down to, if we want to do 50 apartments, what are the levers we can actually pull to affect the decision-making process? So, balconies, unit sizes, simple mechanical systems, automobiles, stuff like that are the things we look to first and most, and then beyond that, we start splitting hairs.
I also think,
Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
I think doing trauma-informed design to, I think there's an investment of time and people on the front end, and, adding dimmer switches to some rooms in a building or adding blackout blinds you know, when you're looking at a $30 million construction budget, you know, that's not big. And, you know, and the conversations that we had around the table at Arroyo too is that thinking about these things actually means that folks are going to have a higher retention rate and a higher success rate in affordable housing, you know, and so the financials of the project for the long run are better, you know, and so it's worth certain investments. But I mean, I think that there's ways to be incredibly creative. You know, I mean, the entrance to the Dolores Project shelter will always be one of my favorite views in the world, right? It's calming. I mean, that wood that's on the ceiling is just like vinyl plank flooring. You know, it's not ridiculously expensive. It's go down to floor and decor. But take a minute to have these thoughts and make it beautiful and inviting. It doesn't have to break the bank. It really doesn't.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, you know, the idea that you need to focus on your priorities, understand what you're going after and what you're not going after, and then from there you can really unleash creativity and find out how to do it affordably. So it's exciting. I've never seen that diagram before that you showed, so it's one of my new favorites. I have a question for Jenny. What sort of questions and discussions were prompted in the focus groups and surveys?
Sure. So we asked pretty obvious questions. What spaces do you feel most safe, least safe? Where do you interact with others? Where do you meet new people? And then we find that with each project and each sort of specific group or each specific set of questions we're exploring, as I said in the chat, our protocol, it's semi-structured, it's super iterative. So it allows us to take these different roads and explore different curiosities. So for example, as I'm, you know, was becoming increasingly curious about, well, how do you feel about a different number of windows and a different layout for each unit? Do you think that's fair? Sounds a bit leading. I think I was a bit more open. But you know, in some sets of interviews, we did up like a pie chart. And we asked people we had crayons and colored pencils, and we asked people to physically draw sort of a pie chart of where they spent most of their time. We asked them to divide it sort of inside their apartment and outside their apartment. And then within their apartment, where they were, outside their apartment, where they were, to just understand how people were using space. And I think what that did, more than like provide some huge aha, I think it helped shift the project team's views and values. For example, we saw that people were in their apartments 99% of the time. And so instead of saying, okay, people need to be outside interacting with others, we kind of realized, okay, this is part of the healing process, and we are talking about a spectrum of needs. And so how do we align our thinking to really meet people where they're at, instead of constantly trying to pull them into spaces that we believe they should be? And so we are willing to share our questions. They're truly nothing fancy. We're doing a round of focus groups right now with youth who have experienced homelessness. So we're in drop-in centers and shelters and housing settings. And we're asking questions like, in shelters and drop-in centers, what are 3 words that describe how you feel in this space? And so I think there's a lot of room for creativity and exploration.
And I think to build off of that question, and Chad, you had mentioned getting funding for pre-development studies, and you know, Jennifer, you're with a university. How do you suggest that folks who want to do some of this research or maybe go after some funding, like how do you suggest seeking out a research partner or figuring out like where to get started, you know, on this type of work in their state or area?
I can start on this maybe. I think the place to start is just a curiosity. You know, it's is having a curiosity about what it is that's animating your community. And it doesn't have to take a lot of money or time. It's more about budgeting time early to go and conduct these outreaches. You know, I think on a recent project, we had 4 or 5 focus groups Each was an hour long, so it's like a day's worth of work with travel and stuff like that. And then Jenny and Laura and others in our lexicon kind of crafted, 15 or 20 questions. And then, Laura's famous for showing up with a pile of gift cards and creating a space for that, Do you guys have anything to add?
Well, I think that's the thing. I mean, it's, acknowledging on your project what's possible, but starting the design process, being in conversation with those with lived experience, and Chad kind of noted the gift cards, but for me, it's like, look, I'm being paid to show up at this table. And folks with lived experience should be compensated too, right? So we give them 20 bucks an hour via Walmart, Target, or Amazon, or whatever else they love. And really, at the beginning of the process, name to them that they are the experts, and you're going to be reaching out to them throughout this whole design process, because it's through those conversations that at Dolores, in the shelter, something that feels safe to me doesn't feel safe to our guests, right? Kind of the one that will always live in infamy in my mind was I put our staff office across from the dorm in the shelter, and I brought it to the guests because the old staff office was across the building. And I was like, look, y'all, the staff office is across the dorm. And they're like, not good enough. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, we want the staff office in the dorm with windows so that people can watch us sleep. And I'm like, that's Big Brother is watching you. And they're like, no, Laura, that's safety, right? And because we had that trusting relationship, that we were in community together, we shifted the design, probably to the annoyance of Shopworks because we did it way too far down the process. But it's about just starting off with those conversations. And we're happy to share. We have, I think, 10 different iterations of questions that we ask, and thinking about the specific trauma of folks, right? The path for folks leaving incarceration, you're going to ask different questions than the mainly women at the Dolores Project, right, as well. Anyway, so I think it's reach out to us. We're happy to share anything we've learned or any questions or research protocol or anything. We're all in this together and we want to do it, and then hear from you what questions you found engaging and got good info from.
Awesome. Rochelle, how do you see the biophilia piece emerging? Are you getting more demand for that in your project? Is it difficult to fund or make the case? Do you find mostly clients are coming to you asking for it, or are you pushing it? How is that really emerging as a trend within the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Certainly we're seeing more conversation in terms of green building certifications, enterprises bringing it in with the healing design and LEED and all these sorts of things. And the conversation is growing. I think the thing about biophilia is it's intuitive, right? We'd always, of course, like spaces like this, but only in the last, 5 to 10 years are we really seeing the research behind it and the science behind it, which is really compelling. So I think it's also as mental health issues grow from all the age ranges, and our disconnect from nature grows, we're starting to see the mental and physical impacts of this. So we're definitely seeing a lot more attention to it and people asking questions. I also think, especially in this time of COVID, it's a nature access or an equitable conversation about who has access to nature, wilderness, but also calming spaces in your home environment, who can go to these places that are safe and secure. So I think this is certainly a growing conversation. And then someone mentioned this in the chat, this isn't just for people that have experienced trauma, this is for everybody. And I think that's a huge conversation we talk about in our group, that of course, this is just design, how it should be. This should be in all buildings, not just trauma-informed buildings, because we all need these opportunities to heal and to be restored and to thrive. And so this is definitely a conversation that we long-term hope to see in all buildings and all urban design.
Well, thank you for that. That's really inspiring. And I have one final question, but before I ask it, I just want to acknowledge you guys as a collaborative. It's really inspiring to see people coming together. I think when Laura wasn't at Shopworks, it was, each of you were at different organizations, and even preparing for these calls, how seamlessly you work together and how it truly is like a labor of love. So our final question is, how can we support your, and this is coming from the audience, but I wish I had asked it myself, how can we support your incredible work and advance these proven measures into education and design program curriculum, or recognized in tools that support new supportive housing projects? Probably see it, and they have a few other things, but yeah, what can we do to help move this forward as practitioners? I know that's a tough, maybe a big question, but if you guys have any ideas.
For me, it's engaging with the topic. You know, we drew that diagram, you know, the 6 values and 3 C's and the context stuff. And that was after working on about 1.5 years. And so I don't think there's any particular right or wrong answer here, except for to neglect the topic. And, you know, if projects are engaging with these types of principles and trying to really grapple with deeper meaning in the built environment, to me, that's it. And like, you know, our next phase of research, actually, we're trying to put a framework around it, and some of it has to do with how do we document outcomes. It's really tricky to have that thought, and as an architect, I don't even know what research is, honestly. But putting some theories into work, and then coming back a year later, 3 years later, and saying, you know, how did we do? Did people remain housed? Was it universally accepted that these principles are good or bad? And what's the increment? And ultimately, you know, in the very big picture, in my greedy way of thinking, cities need to really adopt these principles. The civil engineering undergraduate students need to be trained in this stuff. I mean, and quit it with the fucking roads everywhere. It's like, you know, we got to have a balance to ecosystems and humans and place, and turn that on. So I'm sure.
Awesome. I am gonna. I know each of you must have your own answer, but I will have to stop you guys there. That was awesome, and we will share their report, the slides, the recording, and, you know, just help disseminate the report, disseminate the diagram. You know, I think I'm correct in saying please reach out to all of you guys. If I can get your email addresses, I'll include them in the follow-up email. And it really, you know, we had so much questions, we didn't get as much the interactive conversation. So please connect offline with, you know, all the speakers. And Katie, I'd just like to pass it over to you to close out the webinar.
Thanks so much, Carrie, and to all of our panelists. We're so glad to have so many people join us today from Denver and throughout the country. Keep building and designing beautiful buildings that are promoting dignity and joy. And thank you for joining us today. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have an awesome day.
Thanks all. Be in touch.